It stands there every night. I hesitated for a long time before talking about this because, even now, as I try to put it into words, part of me is still searching for a rational explanation, clinging to any detail that might prove this is just coincidence or imagination. But the problem is that it happens too consistently to be random. It started subtly, with the feeling that something in my room was different, even though everything looked the same. And at first I couldn't even identify what exactly was bothering me, until one night I woke up and noticed that there was a part of the room, specifically the corner, where the darkness looked wrong. I don't mean just a shadow or lack of light, because it felt more like a shape that didn't match the structure of the room, as if something was occupying that space without reflecting light the way normal objects do. I began observing it from a distance, trying not to focus on it too much, but with each night the presence became more defined, almost as if it was adjusting to being noticed. I tried turning on the light, getting up, walking closer, but every time I did, the corner looked completely normal, and that only made things worse, because the contrast between what I saw in the dark and what I saw in the light was too extreme. The worst part happened when I decided to lie still and pretend to be asleep, just to see if anything would change if I stopped reacting. And that's when I realized it wasn't just a shape, because at some point, it moved. It was a subtle shift, barely noticeable, but enough to destroy any remaining hope that it was just a trick of light. And after that, I couldn't think of it as harmless anymore. Since then, I've stopped trying to look directly at that corner, because I have a feeling it's not just standing there, it's waiting for me to look again. I didn't come home alone. I was walking home late that evening, which wasn't unusual for me, since my schedule often runs late, and the route I take has become so familiar that I can walk it almost automatically, listening to music and getting lost in my own thoughts without paying much attention to what's around me. That night felt no different at first, until I started noticing a strange sensation that was difficult to define, because it wasn't tied to a specific sound or something I could see, but rather to the rhythm of footsteps around me, which felt off. I stopped to check if I was imagining it, and in that moment, everything seemed to fall silent, because the faint sound of footsteps that I had been subconsciously picking up stopped at the exact same time I did, and the timing was too precise to ignore. I kept walking, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the faster I moved, the stronger the feeling became that someone behind me was adjusting to my pace, not catching up and not falling behind, but maintaining a distance that I couldn't clearly define, yet couldn't ignore. I didn't turn around, because at some point, the fear became so real that I simply didn't want to see what might be there, and all I could think about was reaching my building as quickly as possible. By the time I got to the entrance, my hands were shaking so badly that I struggled to unlock the door, and as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it clearly. Something entered with me, even though I didn't hear anything or see any movement. I tried to convince myself it was just anxiety, but when the elevator arrived almost immediately and I stepped inside, the feeling only intensified, because the space was too small for anything to go unnoticed. As the doors began to close, I looked up at the reflection in the metal panel, more out of habit than intention. And that's when I realized I had been wrong to think I hadn't seen anyone behind me, because in the reflection, I wasn't alone. Someone was living in my closet. I've never considered myself an easily frightened person, and I've always been able to rationalize the kinds of noises you hear at night, especially in older buildings, where pipes, Floorboards and even slight changes in temperature can create sounds that feel far more intentional than they actually are. Which is why when I first heard a faint rustling coming from my closet, I didn't think much of it. I live alone in a small studio apartment where everything is within sight, and the closet is directly across from my bed, meaning I can see its outline even in the dark. And that night I was lying there, just about to fall asleep, when I heard what sounded like fabric shifting slightly, as if something inside had brushed against my clothes. I assumed it was a draft or, at worst, some kind of small animal, even though I had never had that issue before, and that should have been the end of it. But the following night, the sound came back. Only this time it was clearer, more deliberate, as if whatever caused it was no longer random. Over the next few days, I started noticing small inconsistencies that didn't seem frightening on their own, but began to build into something I couldn't ignore, because my clothes were no longer arranged the way I left them. And one morning, I found a hoodie on the floor that I clearly remembered hanging up. I tried to explain it away as carelessness or fatigue, but everything changed the night I woke up to a completely different sound, one that couldn't be mistaken for anything normal, because it was slow and dragging, like fingernails being drawn across wood from the inside. I lay there, completely still, barely breathing, listening as the sound repeated itself, and at some point it became clear that it wasn't just coming from the closet, but from inside it, as if something was occupying a space that should have been empty. The next day, I forced myself to open it, expecting to find something that would explain everything, but there was nothing there except my clothes, which once again looked like they had been disturbed, not randomly, but with purpose, as if something had been searching for space among them. After that, I started locking the closet at night, almost instinctively, as if that would somehow change anything, and for a while, nothing happened. Until one night I woke up to a sound so faint that at first I thought it was part of a dream, until it became clearer. It was whispering. It didn't sound like a voice traveling through the room or bouncing off walls, because there was something contained about it, something enclosed. And that's when I realized I wasn't hearing it from the room. I was hearing it from inside the closet. And the worst part wasn't the sound itself, but the feeling that whatever was inside wasn't trying to get out, but had no doubt that it didn't need to. There was a folder about me. I've never really cared much about buying used electronics because I've always believed that as long as a device works, it doesn't really matter who owned it before you, especially if you plan to wipe it clean and make it your own, which is why buying a secondhand laptop seemed like a perfectly reasonable decision. When I brought it home, I turned it on right away to check the system, and I noticed that the previous owner hadn't bothered to fully reset it, because there were still files and folders left on the desktop, most of which looked completely normal, like documents or old downloads. I was about to delete everything, but one folder caught my attention, mainly because it had no name, no visible date, and no indication of what it contained, and out of curiosity more than anything else, I decided to open it before clearing the rest. Inside, there were dozens of video files, and at first I assumed they were just personal recordings that the previous owner forgot to remove. But the moment I opened the first one, I realized that wasn't the case, because the person in the video was me. I was sleeping in my bed. The footage was taken from the corner of the room, roughly from the same position where my wardrobe stands, and the angle was so precise that I had no doubt it was my apartment. At first, I tried to convince myself it was some kind of prank or coincidence, but when I checked the file date, I felt a cold wave run through me, because it had been recorded the previous night, at a time when I was actually asleep at home. I started opening more files, and with each video, it became worse, because they showed different moments of my life, recorded from different angles, sometimes during the day, sometimes at night, even at times when I was absolutely certain I was alone. And then the worst realization hit me. I had only bought that laptop today, but the recordings had been going on for a long time. My daughter said I shouldn't see him. I've always been calm about the idea of imaginary friends, because I understand that it's a normal part of childhood development, and until recently I was convinced that if my daughter ever started talking to someone who wasn't there, I would treat it as just a phase that would eventually pass. My daughter is 6 years old, and she's generally calm and not prone to that kind of imagination, which is why I never even considered something like this until one night when I heard her talking in her room, not just mumbling in her sleep, but having what sounded like a quiet, structured conversation, as if she was responding to someone. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming she was dreaming or not fully awake, but it started happening almost every night, and each time there was something unusual in her voice, not fear or excitement, but a kind of focus that didn't feel natural for a child her age. One night, I decided to stand by her door and listen without going in, so I wouldn't scare her. And that's when I clearly heard what she was saying. She said, "No, he shouldn't see you." I felt something tighten in my chest because I was standing right outside the door, which meant she was talking about me, even though, as far as I knew, there was no one else in that room. I carefully pushed the door open just enough to look inside without making noise, and I saw her sitting on her bed, turned not toward the door, but toward the corner of the room, where there was nothing but a wardrobe and an empty wall. I was about to step in and ask who she was talking to, but in that moment, she suddenly went quiet, as if she heard something I couldn't, and slowly turned her head toward me. Her face was completely calm, but her eyes didn't look like a child's. And before I could say anything, she quietly added, "I told you he's looking." The elevator stopped where there is no floor. I've been living in this building for almost 4 years, and during that time, I never had any reason to question how things work here, because it's a typical 9-floor apartment block with predictable layouts, familiar neighbors, and an elevator that, despite occasional noises, generally behaves exactly the way you expect it to. Which is why what happened that night initially felt like nothing more than a minor technical glitch. I was coming home late, exhausted after work, and all I wanted was to get to my 7th floor as quickly as possible, walk into my apartment, and go to sleep without thinking about anything else. So when the elevator started moving, I didn't even look at the display and just leaned against the wall until I felt it stop. I expected to see the number 7, but when I looked up, the display showed 10. And at first, it only annoyed me, because I assumed the elevator had malfunctioned or skipped floors somehow, even though I clearly knew the building only had 9. The doors opened slowly, as they usually do, and for a moment, I couldn't immediately understand what felt wrong, because the hallway looked normal, except for the fact that there were no lights, and the space itself seemed longer than it should have been, as if the structure didn't match the rest of the building. I had no intention of stepping out, because I was already convinced this was some kind of error. But as the doors fully opened, I noticed that someone was standing at the far end of the corridor, and even though the distance was significant, I could clearly make out a human silhouette that wasn't moving and appeared to be facing directly towards me.
A sense of unease started to build, but I was still trying to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably just a neighbor or someone who somehow ended up on a maintenance floor, even though, deep down, I knew none of that made sense. I didn't move, and fortunately, the doors began to close on their own. But right at that moment, something happened that completely shattered any attempt at logic, because the figure at the end of the hallway moved. It wasn't sudden, but slow and deliberate, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. And just before the doors shut completely, it felt like the distance between us had shortened, even though I hadn't moved at all. Ever since that night, I refuse to use the elevator alone after dark, because I can't shake the feeling that if the doors had closed just a little slower, it would have made it inside with me.